We're now in the corner of the Brooklands Museum aircraft factory, and behind me is the cockpit section of a Vickers Valiant bomber, the last in fact to be built here at Brooklands. The design of the Valiant stems from a 1947 British Air Ministry requirement for a bomber that could deliver one of the new nuclear weapons that were then being developed, could cruise at a speed of 500 knots and have a service ceiling of 55,000 feet. George Edwards, who had been recently appointed as chief designer at Vickers, produced what he called an unfunny design for this aircraft, by which he meant that it was aerodynamically straightforward by comparison with the other designs that were being put forward by other manufacturers, such as Avro, which ended up being the Vulcan, and Handley Page, which ended up being the Victor. George Edwards' design had 4 Rolls-Royce Avon jet engines. It had a modestly swept wing, and he used his experience of pressurized cabins to produce the 5-man cockpit that we see behind us. One interesting point is that, for instance, the escape hatch of this aircraft, which is on the other side of the cockpit from where I'm standing, bears a remarkable resemblance, for instance, to the oval windows of the Vickers Viscount. This is because George Edwards was totally convinced that any aperture in a pressurized fuselage should be either curved or oval in shape, and thus most of the apertures in the aircraft that he designed were of that form. The other thing that George Edwards was convinced about was that this aircraft should be delivered on time and to budget. But he was concerned that he was not able to guarantee the sort of range that the Air Ministry was requiring. In the end, the Air Ministry decided that his offer of budget and time frame was worth the reduction in range that he could not guarantee, and they issued a revised requirement that enabled the construction of 2 prototypes to go ahead. These prototypes were put together at Fox Warren, which is the location of the Vickers Experimental Department that was set up during the Second World War. The aircraft were built there. They were taken in sections to Wisley Airfield, which was about 5 or 6 miles away, and there they were reconstructed and flown in 1951 off the grass runway. This actually turned out not to be a terribly good idea because, as you can probably imagine, flying a 4-jet large bomber off a grass runway rather ruins the surface. So very quickly, tarmac runways were built both at Wisley and at Brooklands in order to accommodate the test flights of what would turn out to be the production aircraft. Unfortunately, there was one aspect of George Edwards' unfunny design that certainly wasn't funny, and that was the choice of what was then a rather novel alloy for major parts of the Valiant structure, including the main spar. This alloy, which was comprised of zinc, copper, magnesium and aluminium, had not really been tried and tested before, although it was also being used by Handley Page, for instance, on their Hastings transport aircraft. It worked fine while the Valiant was in high-level flight. But as we'll see in a minute, that was not to be lasting for the rest of its life, because although 107 Valiants were built and went into service with the Royal Air Force, in the early 1960s, with the advent of more sophisticated Cold War weaponry, it was decided that the V bomber force, the Valiant, the Vulcan and the Victor, should operate at low level and also at high speed. it was discovered fairly early on that the main spar of the Valiant, made of this rather novel alloy, was really not up to the low-level job with all the extra forces that were being put upon it and the stresses and strains. And eventually, and rather sadly, in January 1965, it was decided that the Valiant force would not be modified to replace the main spar with a different alloy that could withstand low-level activity, and all Valiants were finally grounded. And that, sadly, was the end of the flying career of the Vickers Valiant. A further sad postscript to the Valiant story is that in 1952, the Air Ministry also issued a requirement for a new large high-speed transport for the Royal Air Force. Vickers responded with a developed version of the Valiant that was to be called the Vickers V1000. This was a airliner with 6 abreast seating, 4 Rolls-Royce Conway engines, transatlantic performance, and indeed there was also proposed a civil version which would be known as the VC7. The Air Ministry rather liked this concept, and in fact they commissioned a prototype to be built. The prototype was being built at Wisley, where a hangar had been constructed for the purpose. But in 1955, with the prototype almost complete, 80% complete in fact, the Ministry decided to scrap the aircraft. The RAF had lost a degree of interest, and the British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, who had been expected to be a customer for the VC7 civil version, also lost interest. So sadly, the prototype, or the fuselage of the prototype, for that existed, was broken up at Wisley. Sir George Edwards commented at the time, "We have just handed to the Americans, without a struggle, the entire world market for large jet airliners."